where are all of us from? I know I'm in Oregon on the west coast of the US.
Yes, well, yeah. So why don't we, when we go ahead, let's do our introductions. But yes, so Marcella, you're in Oregon, and why don't you go ahead and do your introduction?
My name is Marcella Bell. I live in Oregon. I prefer the pronouns she and her, and I'm super excited to be participating in the Frankfurt Book Fair. I'm a bookseller, so it's kind of like the Catalina wine mixer.
I'm just going to go in clockwise order, so that means Denise on my screen is next.
Great. I'm Denise Williams, she, her pronouns, and How to Fail at Flirting is my debut novel that's out in December. And I am in Iowa in the US, so right in the heart of the middle of the country. And I'm also excited to be here at the book equivalent of the Catalina wine mixer.
Okay, go ahead, Thien-Kim.
Yeah, so I'm Thien-Kim Lam, and I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And my first book is called Happy Endings, and it will be out in May 2021. And my pronouns are she, her.
And Stacey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stacey Agdern, and my pronouns are she, her. I am from Westchester County, New York. The town in particular is known for its place in literary history, and I also, fun fact about me, live about maybe 5 minutes from my favorite hockey team's practice facility. My most recent my most recent book is my debut novel, which is Miracles and Menorahs. It came out on the 23rd of this week. I'm sorry, the 13th of this week, because my brain is elsewhere. And just before that, I was very proud to be involved in an anthology called Love All Year, which was released on September 22nd. I am very, very excited to be on this panel and part of the Frankfurt Book Festival. I am also a former bookseller. I was the romance buyer for an independent bookstore in New York City for 10 years. So this is definitely coming to my roots.
That is new information for me about Stacey. Yep. And everyone, I'm going to be moderating the panel. I am Elizabeth Kahn. You know me as E on Twitter. And I was the sort of editor publisher also of Love All Year, which I'm sorry, there is no hard copy. So that is our cover. And I'm also one of the admins for Romance Sparks Joy. And for those of you who don't know what Romance Sparks Joy is, it is a group on Twitter and other places whose mission is to amplify underrepresented voices in romance. And so I'm also really excited, and thank you to the Frankfurt Book Fair for hosting this and giving us this opportunity to participate in something we otherwise would not be able to. So let's get started. Denise, did you also want to make sure, Denise and Marcella, did you mention your upcoming books?
Oh, I did not.
Okay.
I'm still in To Wear His Crown, which is Harlequin Presents, and then Mills and Boon Modern, I think. I'm very excited. Comes out December 1st.
December 1st. And Denise, what is your upcoming title? Did you mention?
I'll show it off again because I love
How to
Fail at Flirting, and it's also at December 1st, so we get to be released.
And Thien-Kim, unfortunately, you do not have a cover yet. That's right. So, well, let's get started. This question is really for everyone, and I was wondering, what is the first romance that you read that really made you feel seen or made you realize that there was space for stories with people with your identity or who look like you or are like you? And I'll just start in counterclockwise, so I'll just start with Thien-Kim.
Okay, this is gonna be sad.
Okay, that's okay.
No, it's The Kiss Quotient is the very first romance I read with the Vietnamese main character. Which, as you know, only came out a few years ago. I mean, before then I read, obviously white couple pairings and interracial pairings, but not specifically a Vietnamese American character. And that was, I was thinking about this a few months ago, and I was like, I cannot believe that was the book. It took that long.
Yeah.
I'm in my early 40s. It took that long for me to read a romance with the Vietnamese main character.
But how amazing did it feel when you read it?
It felt amazing because it not only, I can't relate to, the Helen Huang's characters live on the West Coast in California, which is like a big enclave of Vietnamese immigrants. So I can't relate to how they grew up there, but just knowing that they shared similar paths growing up, and their, Vietnamese parents are very similar in how they raise their children. Just to know that that was me, like that was my life, that could be my cousins, and it felt very affirming and validating.
Absolutely. Marcella, how about you? What was that first book that you read where you saw yourself?
So it's not an Own Voices book, but it's by Dark Possession by Christine Feehan. So I love paranormal romance, and when I read Dark Possession, it was the first romance that I ever read where the heroine was Black. And I remember just kind of the way it washed over me. So there was so I've been reading romance since I was like 12 years old. So Dark Possession came out in 2007. So Thien-Kim, like, it's similar. It was a long time. And while I think you're right, Vietnamese representation is so much like less prevalent than even Black representation, which also is still kind of underrepresented. So I mean, there were these options, but growing up in the Northwest, it's not a very diverse area. And so what I had at my library, what I had around, this was the first time I ever picked something up that had this Black heroine and paranormal and magical and wonderful. And what really struck me was it felt like Christine Feehan had received letters. Like, it felt like she had received fan mail, and then she wrote the book that her fans requested. So it felt like being heard and seen in a really powerful way.
So yes, definitely. And Denise, how about you?
I really kind of similarly, I really had to think back because it wasn't that long ago, but I'm a fairly new romance reader. And so the very first arc I read when I joined sort of Romance Landia, I think I had like 7 Twitter followers, and Rebecca Weatherspoon put out that she needed arc readers for Rafe, which is her story about the buff nanny, which hits all my buttons. But so I read that, and I had read Black heroines before, and I had read heroines in kind of doctor, lawyer types of jobs before. But something about that combination and the way the character was described for me just hit that button of I see myself here. And I'm a multiracial person. And so representation for that I think really hits for me is still something I'm kind of looking for, but I love when I see it in pieces in books where it just normalizes things that have been my experience. And I think it was Alicia Ray talked about, are we allowed to say nipples? I don't know, I just said it. But like brown nipples, like how do we describe bodies? And how do we normalize how different bodies look different? And it doesn't have to be a whole thing, but how do we just normalize that in our reading? And so that was that first book, I think, that for me, I really saw myself in, even though it wasn't the first character I'd read.
And I'm just going to segue off that a tiny bit before I go to Stacey. I remember there was an arc that came out of a book maybe last year, where that was an issue. Like, well, I guess we're going to say the nipples were the wrong color. And but it took that arc and that lens of people with that identity to read that and say, no, that's not right. So like it's those little things that come through that are so important in that representation, instead of just like a caricature of a person or a cardboard cutout, right? Okay, Stacey, how about you? I feel like I might know because
I may have mentioned this a time or two, but so I was a slightly later romance reader. But Marcella, when you were talking about the Christine Feehan title, you mentioned 2007, and 2007 was kind of a remarkable year because the same year that the book that you were talking about came out, Deirdre Martin released a book called Chasing Stanley. It's not an Own Voices book. The heroine, the cover, there's like this huge, beautiful Newfoundlander dog and the Stanley Cup on the cover. And this was an interfaith book, but the heroine is Jewish. The heroine is a Jewish dog walker from Long Island. And
Like
I could
hockey?
recognize people. Yeah, the hero's a hockey player from the Midwest. And the thing is, like, I had read, you know, Christian heroines celebrating their holidays on the page in so many books, and like seeing like huge Irish families getting together on the pages, but like nothing that reflected anything that I knew, nothing that reflected what my experience was. And the thing is, like, you know, within the Jewish reader and writer community, we talk a lot about this particular book because it has different sort of effects. Like when you were talking, Thien-Kim, about how the KISS quotient was set on in California, but you sort of saw things that you recognized, but you didn't completely sort of like identify with part of the Vietnamese experience in California. Like it's the same conversation that happens with Chasing Stanley with people who live on the West Coast who are Jewish. Like for me, Chasing Stanley reminds me, the heroine's family in Chasing Stanley reminds me of my own family, like the Long Island branches of my family. But for others, it's different. It's not as close.
Yeah, and that's also part of like being part of the diaspora, you know, which goes for all of us, you know. There's always going to be those shared elements, but then also some things that are wholly unique to your location. Like Thien-Kim, I know that we've talked about the specificity of being Vietnamese American from New Orleans.
Well, not from Louisiana, not that.
From Louisiana, sorry.
New Orleans is a whole different, is a very different vibe than the rest of the state. But yeah, and I think that is, you know, why we need more own voices and more story, not just one or two people of each, you know, a background to write romances, but we need a whole bunch so that everyone can find that one specific book like Denise and Rafe that resonates with them, that really talks about their specific experience. Like we shouldn't be the, like, you know, Helen Huang should not be the only one representing Vietnamese culture and romance. Like there's so many experiences all over the world.
Yeah, or even like broader than that, like you shouldn't have to just be, I mean, Jeannie Lin is amazing, but you know, it shouldn't be like, oh, well, here's an Asian American author, have fun. You know, it's seeing that real, those little things that really remind you of your life and your family. So I'm just
sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I think that was an interesting part of writing a debut novel that was own voices or speaking to your own identities, because I think there's also that external pressure. It's internal, it's external. Like I have to get this right, and I have to get it right for everybody, you know, at the same time as other people are saying, you didn't get this right for me. And so I think that's, you know, interesting of being a debut, because it's your first book, and figuring out how do I find my level ground for myself? How do I do good work and be okay that it doesn't fit everybody? And I think we get there. Hopefully we do, so we can be well. But for me, that was kind of is a challenge. And I think that is probably a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
I'm gonna piggyback on what you said, Denise, because I struggled a lot with how Vietnamese do I make my story, right? And like, am I falling prey to stereotypes that, you know, mainstream readers want to see about Vietnamese people? Like, so like my heroine is not good in school, but her siblings are. Like that's like any family, right? You have, but people expect, you know, oh yeah, she's gonna have a fight with her family because they want her to do traditional things and she doesn't. Like, am I just giving into what mainstream readers expect from Asian characters? So I struggled a lot with that. And thankfully my editor at Avon, Erica, and we talked a lot about that. And she said, you know, just have to write your experience and be true to yourself. And I tried.
And I haven't even had a peek at it, but I'm positive that you did. So I have some questions for each of you, but please, all of you, piggyback off of these questions. So Stacey, I was wondering, what do you do? How do you handle defining, or do you define concepts, words that might not be familiar to readers who aren't Jewish. How do you handle that in your books?
So there are tons of different ways to approach this question. And luckily, within the last 2 months, I've had 2 different books that explore 2 different Jewish holidays, 2 different stories that explore 2 different Jewish holidays. In Love All Year, I talk about the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. Not very much is known about that holiday. It's not necessarily something that comes very much into the mainstream. It's not something that is sort of part of sort of sort of general Christian like cultural existence, right? So inevitably, part of that story, a large part of that story, was spent explaining, but not explaining what the holiday was, because it makes sense if you didn't understand if a reader didn't understand what the holiday was. Sukkot is a harvest holiday. It was actually last week and a couple weeks ago, I should say, and you know, it's part of observance, but it's not necessarily talked about all that often. As opposed to Miracles and Menorahs, which came out this past week, I spent no time explaining what Hanukkah was. None. Not at all. I might have talked about certain specific customs that aren't necessarily already part of the vernacular, but you think about Hanukkah, you think about sort of contemporary culture as a general rule, and 90% of the time, when people are talking about Jews, they're talking about Hanukkah.
Yeah.
And so it made absolutely no sense to explain that concept. So that's kind of how I feel about it. Like if it's a concept that's already it's already part of the vernacular, it's already in culture, like there's absolutely no point in explaining it. If it's something that people aren't familiar with, sure, I don't mind explaining. Like there is so much, so.
No, I was going to say it's frustrating though, because, and I'm sure that all of you have an experience with something like this, because Hanukkah is actually, you know, surprise everyone, it's actually not that big of a holiday. Yes, it lasts 8 days, but it's not the most important holiday by far. And so it's interesting that that's the one that everyone knows about. And so, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's timing and it's also representation. That's the thing. Like, it's that sort of one time out of the year, and I'd like to see more, like, exactly, where we're seen, not as, you know, random people who, like, don't celebrate, you know, Christmas or don't go to church or, like, don't have a pastor that they know, or, you know, all of these sort of things that are considered sort of defaults within culture, you know. For like 8 days out of the year, you can take this experience and use it to center Jewish joy, and sort of alter that default, alter that Christian cultural default, and sort of switch the lens to a more Jewish-centered one, and sort of, and like, you know, allow that kind of representation to flourish.
And then just one more thing on that, something that I loved was that you did not define Yiddish terms. Like you just used them and kept on going with your day, you know? And my mom, who knew all those words, was like, why didn't she define them? I was like, Mom, you know what they mean. But she's like, oh, but the Gentiles, they're fine, they'll live.
And that's the thing, like, I think one of the things about the Yiddish terms that I used in Miracles and Menorahs, they're already part of the vernacular. You know, they're already in culture, like they're already, like, random people like will randomly use the word, oh, that Shashka over there, or oh my God, he's such a schmuck, or etc., etc., etc. And so I felt absolutely no need to sit and define these terms because people already know them. And whether they know where they come from is another question, but they know them.
Sorry, my Google Home thought I was talking to it when I said Google is free.
No, but I think we should normalize people Googling things they don't know, because, you know, like if you're reading a book where a family speaks Spanish, you're not going to stop and explain what a word, you know, what a sentence means. And and I think so many people read on e-readers, and I know my Kindle app, I can look up I can highlight a sentence and it will translate it. Maybe it's not the best translation, but it'll give me enough. And based on the context clues, I can, understand what's happening in the story.
Right. And yeah, exactly. It's so easy. And why should we waste time in a beautiful story being a dictionary, right? I wanted to ask Marcella, like, you are writing category romance. And so what does it mean for you to be bringing own voices to category romance?
So, I mean, in broadly, when we talk about own voices, it's a very broad idea. So we're talking about stories, characters, narratives that are traditionally underrepresented in fiction, in nonfiction as well, actually, just in literature. And then we bring this level of our experience. And so in the process of debuting, I have been reading through, so there's this wonderful company called Ideal Bookshelf, and they do prints of different books. And they have one on writing, which features kind of like the most popular writing books, and popular by means of best-selling, kind of not giving a quality assessment to them. But I've been reading them a lot, and the common thread, the admonition that the great writers tell you is to tell the truth. And so as romance writers, we're telling the truth about relationships and about love. So when I bring own voices to that, I'm telling the truth about people like me falling in love and engaging in a relationship. But there's also other formats that fly. So I have a category romance coming out. And this is, in the US, we call it Harlequin Presents, and then it's Mills and Boon's Modern. And this is the kind of story that is full of high fantasy and luxury. It's the princess story. It's the sweeping you off the feet. So what Own Voices is in this book, I mean, it's actually set in an imaginary kingdom. So clearly no one actually lives here. It's not about their cultural experience in the sense of like their society and their idea, but it is about how a Black body feels. And I'm mixed, so it's how a mixed body feels in a Cinderella transformation. And so you're going to see a lot of the same, because category people come to category for that thing that they love. You're going to see that classic thing you love in this story, but you're going to see it happen to a body that maybe isn't as commonly positioned in that place. And you're going to see it informed by what it's like to be in that body. So I make a joke, but it's your classic Cinderella transformation, but it takes a little longer to do her hair because she's got a big full head of curly natural hair, and that takes a long time. So using that as a specific example, when we were writing this, there's a scene where she gets her hair done, and it starts in the beginning of the day in the morning and it ends in the afternoon. And it actually came up in the editing process. They're like, oh, did you mean to do that? I'm like, yes, because I've never gone to the salon and spent less than 4 hours. That's for the shortest amount of time to do my hair. And so kind of bringing those features and facets into a story that, especially, I mean, around the world, so many people love that Cinderella story.
Yes.
And myself, I always dreamed of that Cinderella, that classic Disney princess experience. And so the main thing I was craving in that story is what it would feel like for someone who looked like me, because I knew it was going to take longer to do my hair, and my skin was going to need a different kind of treatment, and my body was going to need a different kind of treatment. So putting all that into that classic position was the way that I brought Own Voices to this. So I have a full length coming out that is far more cultural. That one is the more expected Own Voices, where you're really bringing cultural history. But for category, it's all about the body and the experience.
Yeah, it's not like the makeup artist doesn't have orange concealer on hand, right? Her palette's completely different.
Exactly. And even certain things. So like for one of the things, like, so I'm from the Northwest, and being from the Northwest, there's not the Northwest can be very progressive, but it's not very, very diverse. And so because of that, there's an automatic exoticism. And so when I was growing up, I personally, and then again, this is what we've talked a little about, Own Voices is there's room for a broad idea, and there's also room for specifics.
I love that.
Specifically, I hate my skin color being described in food terms. Like, I can't stand it. So I don't want to be chocolate, and I don't want to be coffee, and this comes it's related to what you said, because I was in theater, and the makeup kits for people of color in theater are very different. So the color palettes that were used to describe any brown tone were always food-based, whereas all of my peers who were Caucasian, it was fairest and lovely and
Porcelain, alabaster.
colors that weren't food. And so in this, that's one of the things I don't describe her with food terms, because for me, that's my little bit of own voices specific coming in, when the broad is maybe the black body, the hair, the experience. The specific is you're not going to find a chocolate skin in here.
And I don't know if anyone watched the Wednesday's panel where they were talking about normalizing bonnets in, did you see that? Yeah, they were talking about normalizing bonnets and satin pillowcases for black hair. Like, this is how we go to sleep. We just don't lie down, you know?
Yeah.
And that was awesome. Denise, I wanted to,
I wanted to add
Yeah.
something to Marcella. And I think so many of us started reading romance through category romance.
Mhm.
And if I had been able to read category romances that didn't have just white characters growing up, it would have meant so much more to me to see other experiences and culture. So I think it's really important that we have representation in category romance.
I'm really excited to see that more and more. And the covers are always just so amazing. Just seeing those covers is just so joyful, you know? Yeah. Thien-Kim, we talked a little bit about this already, but I wanted to ask you, how do you try and smash, as you say in your bio, stereotypes about Vietnamese Americans, or in general? Like
Well, you know, in a broader sense, I think about how Asian women are portrayed in TV and movies and you know, books. You know, there's not as many Asian women romance stories, but there's always a stereotype, like they're either virginal and innocent, or you know, super sexy and evil, and you know, and I'm like, there's not they're polar opposites, and you see that a lot. You know, one is always a villain and one is always the damsel in distress. And I really wanted to write characters that are not those, because you know, Asian women, Vietnamese women in particular, like, we're complex just like everyone else in this world. And to only see stories about people doing specific things, like smart Asian kids or nerdy Asian guys, you know, it's a disservice, not just to our community, but to everyone else reading and watching those. So for me, that's so important to portray them. Yeah, so my heroine, her parents are traditional, and you know, her parents want her to be, you know, a lawyer, doctor, or whatever. But I think that happens in a lot of families, right? And to show her trying to go out on her own, and she's struggling with, like a lot of us do, like, do we want to make our parents happy, or do we want to make ourselves happy? And I think that is more tenuous in immigrant families. And also, there's so many stories out there, not just in romance, but in literature, about Vietnamese families, but they're all immigrant stories. They're all refugee stories. And that, you know, my parents came over in 1975. There's 3 generations since then of Vietnamese people living in America, not as immigrants, but as, you know, natural born citizens, and their experiences are different. And we don't see enough of those. And that's what I want to show with my books.
Yeah, that 3rd generation, that 4th generation experience, which is so very different, but still not represented. And that's also, I think, common of all diaspora stories.
Right, and I think that you know, so many publishers and critics have really celebrate those trauma stories, is what I call them.
They love it.
And while those experiences are important, they're not the only ones out there. Not everyone suffers.
Right.
And you know, what Stacey said earlier about Jewish joy, like, that's so important. We have to show all marginalized communities can be happy, can be joyful, even if there are barriers keeping us from being our very best.
Or even, I mean, we don't necessarily think about those sad things all the time.
I want to get out of bed.
It'd be horrible, right? And also it informs a lot of our lives, but it's not always like 100% present, you know? And also we all have different relationships with those major tragedies or those major moments in our identity's history, you know. For example, and I don't want to talk too much about myself, but just for example, like my family came over in the 1900s, so I have no connection like personally to the Holocaust. And so to have that represented as this story that's about it doesn't match my life, you know what I mean? It's still important, but it's not the only thing that you want to talk about, right?
Yeah, the thing I say often is in some of the different writing that I do around my characters is some things are the character and some things are the story. Yeah. And there's all these nuances of things that are the character, and some of those may be the pain or the history or the trauma, personally, globally, generationally, whatever, that you carry that with you, but that's part of who you are. That's part of who you are moving through this story, but it's not always the crux of the story.
Yeah. There's other things that inform our lives. It's not just this one thing, but it's still a big thing and needs to be seen and heard. And Denise actually kind of goes into what I was going to ask you is, you know, how do you bring your work as a DEI in diversity, equity, and inclusion into your writing?
Yeah, so I've worked in higher education for a little over 15 years, and the bulk of that has been working with students of color and teaching around things related to diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership. I'm on a board for an organization nationally that looks at race and ethnicity in higher education. And so I spend a lot of time in my day talking about race. I'm working with people of color. And I have 3 degrees in people, psychology. I have a master's, a PhD in education. And so all of that is to say that is really helpful in writing people, particularly characters who work in higher ed. So hopefully for me. But also I feel like I could take my own story, but a lot of time spent studying racial identity development and ethnicity identity development and how these things impact education. My heroine is a professor of color. How that looks as we move through our own development in adulthood, and all of that kind of goes into my character. But I've also been able to take a lot of what I've gotten from romance and brought that back to my work. And so I work with PhDs, I work with people who do this studying. And for those who are in the academy or those who are familiar with it, there is this sort of level of, let's gently call it snobbery in terms of what should be read and written and what's smart and all of these things. And so for a long time, I kept a copy of The Goldfinch on my Kindle, never read it. But when somebody looked at my Kindle, they weren't going to see all these other romance novels I was reading and be like, oh, look, yeah, I'm only 15% of the way in. Again, never read it, picked an arbitrary place. But there was this sort of shame that I had of being in these two, what felt like 2 different roles. And so now I try to normalize that in my work. So when I'm talking with students, if they ask about the book, I tell them it's romance, and I talk about, if it fits in the conversation, talk about sex positivity and talk about gender and talk about why I love stories. And I found so many of my colleagues who do that too. And so I think there's a lot of power for me in being able to bring my academic knowledge and my training experience into my writing, but then also to take what I've learned from romance and what I know to be true from romance and apply that to the work. And there's so many people who are fitting with that. I think the other thing that I was really excited to connect my work to is that in higher education, people of color, particularly Black people, particularly Black women, or Black people who are non-binary, are so marginalized and so erased. If you Google professor and try to find a stock image, good luck.
Because I know.
There's nothing. And there's this erasure. And so I really wanted to show my heroine being in that world. And there are, not many, there's not very many of us, period. But there are Black people and multiracial people who are doing great work in African American studies and some of these other academic areas, but that seems to be the lens of where we slot them, and those are the places you can be. So my heroine is a math education professor. Hate math, don't know why I chose that, but I love that she's sort of in this STEM world, and
yes, oh my gosh, yes, because
in that area of being this person and trying to navigate it.
And like Linda just popped into the chat, like BIPOC in academia, especially women, have to do so much extra work on top of just being in academia, which is hard enough. There's just, you know, it's that you're being held up to this much higher standard of, and so, yeah, it's, I'm excited.
There's a whole other panel to have that.
Yeah, that is, I just realized we go into a whole, but also, I mean, it's interesting that you're bringing it back to your work, because I've also sort of come out of the closet as a romance reader more and more. And I was just talking with someone yesterday about one of Adriana Herrera's books, and about how amazing it is to see someone, it was American Sweethearts, and how seeing someone whose goal, whose like purpose in life was making sure that Black bodies and brown bodies were experiencing pleasure and joy, and like to be able to bring that conversation back in, it's interesting, right? We never knew that it would be informing this, right?
It's not why I set out to write a romance novel, but I lead a leadership program on my campus that's around empowerment, and I talk about that a lot in terms of owning our pleasure and owning our identities in pleasure and happiness, and what that looks like. And so romance provides a really good lens, and I know others kind of on the panel do similar things kind of in other venues too.
Especially when, go ahead, Tien.
Oh no, I said, yeah, that's so important. Like my heroine, she sells sex toys, and you know, when people look at Asian women, they don't think that, they think of Asian women as sexual beings, but not in this way where they're in charge of their pleasure and really owning and seeking it out. And her mission is, you know, like she didn't learn from her family or as a young person. So now that she knows, she's on a mission to teach everyone.
Yeah. And also, I think for all of us and all of our identities, especially cis women, are always pigeonholed into these relationships with sex. Like, you know, there's always the stories about Jewish girls and blowjobs, you know, and all sorts of things. Like, see, everyone thinks this is something men talk about, I guess. But there's this whole idea, right, about each one of us, about how we would act in that area. And so it's great to be able to subvert that and flip that, and so like take it out of that box, which you're definitely doing. I mean, everyone's doing, but like, I love that Thien-Kim. And also Thien-Kim, for people who don't know, has an amazing business. Go ahead, tell us.
Sure. My when I'm not writing, I'm running Body Bookworms, and it's a subscription box that pairs romances with erotic toys, so they kind of go together. And our monthly box, the Quickie, really focuses on own voices and marginalized communities, and just really to show people, like people of color, people of different identities can find joy and happiness and true love.
You're living the work, you're living that, and I love that. So I have some other more general questions for everyone. And one thing I wanted to bring up is, so this is the Frankfurt Book Fair, you know, and so and I think that we have touched on this some, but maybe there might be more, like, how do we explain this issue about representation to readers who are unfamiliar with this discourse in the States on this? I mean, this concept of race, the way that we have it in the United States, is very specific to us. And so when we talk about the importance of representation, I wonder how that translates for people outside the States. But do you all have to say about that? What would you say about that to people who maybe aren't familiar with this conversations that we have about this? Oh, don't all jump at once. I'll call on someone. I told you I'd go into teacher mode.
Proximal student, I will. You know, I think it depends on the context, but you know, even though race has a very specific interlinked history in the US, I think colonialism has touched many areas.
Yes.
And I think every area has those histories around identity. It might not be race, but it could be ethnicity, it could be social class, it could be language. I mean, there's so many different pieces. And so, you know, I think that is a way to frame a discussion in looking at why this representation piece matters. You know, I think the other piece is that sometimes the context is that there are dollars on the table. You know, that there are people who want to read and want to buy books about people who are like them. And, you know, if we don't have those books, what are we leaving on the table in terms of a business model, in terms of keeping our readers and keeping our customers or whatever the frame is, you know, engaged with the books that we have. And so I think that there's those two pieces that are fairly universal for folks who are in this work.
And as the diaspora is always dispersing. It's always growing and moving, and so the readers are everywhere now, you know. Oh, sorry, Marcella, were you gonna? No, she's like, no.
My dog's being a little crazy, so she may. But I really love what you said, Denise, and I think that so when I initially kind of thinking about this question, I was like, you know, this is an issue kind of throughout many cultures, because if the idea is that own voices and representation is working to raise up the representation of whoever is underrepresented, every culture has underrepresented groups. And so like there's a commonality in the fact that worldwide we all have to do the work. So one of the wonderful things we've seen right now with Black Lives Matter, really, that's been worldwide. It's all around world that people, because there are people of African descent all over the world who have been disenfranchised. And so I think there's some certain amount of commonality that comes because we are kind of sharing this experience. And then I also think in explaining it for the American context, it's always so critical to remember our history. So this is a country that the Europeans that came here were coming because they needed, there's an aspirational and an escape. So you talk about diaspora, that the commons are taken away in Europe, and you get these displaced Europeans coming to the New World, and they then displace people when they get this like cycle of displacement. In America, we had this strong urge, I think, to grow something good, but also have a really hard time examining ourselves. We have a really hard time looking at who we are and what we actually do. And that conflict, I think, leads to both the lack of representation and the need for representation here in the States. This is really probably the only way we're going to get people to actually become comfortable with their real history. It's fiction, but it's actually, that's the way we touch hearts. So in the States, it's important for us to have more representation because we have a lot of self-examination to do, and we examine ourselves through our pop culture and our fiction so much better than we do through nonfiction. Through it just sinks in, it's easier to digest. So that's in the States context, it's this opportunity for us to really sit with who we are and to see what that means moving forward for us. And it's going to be different worldwide, though the issues may be similar.
Yeah, it's not just seeing ourselves in these stories, it's other people seeing us in these stories. That's so important. I love that.
Yeah, and I want to add, so the pairing in my book there, the hero is Black, and the heroine is Vietnamese. And I think that there's not enough interracial romances with where both people are from a marginalized community, right? You see a lot of Asian pairings with white people. You know, that's acceptable. It's even acceptable in my culture. Like, you don't marry, you know, people darker than you. And I want to normalize it. And I think that's also, it's not just a US thing, right? For for people to disapprove of interracial pairing. So I think it's important for me to write those sorts of stories to center their joy and not have their cultural background be the conflict, right? Because their family or their culture doesn't approve that yes, love is love is love, and this is possible. Like, you don't have to suffer and talk about your skin color for half the book in order to find true love. It can happen.
Absolutely. Stacey, did you have?
So thinking about a lot of different things in diaspora,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of altering the lens just slightly. In 2019, I think, let me see if I wrote this down. Yes, it was 2019. Sharon Ibbotson, through Chocolate in the UK, published what I could possibly figure is was like one of the first British interfaith Hanukkah romances. It's called Hanukkah at the Great Greenwich Ice Creamery. And the thing is, like, we were talking about sort of how long and the sort of interesting sort of tie-in between the Jewish diaspora and like international questions. I have family in France. They are the only European relatives that I possess at the moment for multiple reasons. But, as we see different sort of instances of situations where anti-Semitism is increasing in general, it's kind of nice to see sort of that sort of paired in some way with experiences of Jewish joy and Jewish representation on the page. So like, in a similar parallel to sort of basically sort of reaffirming the idea that, like, as we talk about representation in terms of different marginalized cultures generally, and sort of the importance of joy and the importance of seeing people on the page having that joy, it is so much more important as prejudice increases, as like incidents increase. It's nice to sort of have those moments where you can open a book, you can open a piece of fiction, generally speaking, and say, this person is getting a happy ever after. This person is getting something joyful, something beautiful. Is getting a fuzzy blanket, as it were.
Yeah.
Quite a number of years ago, I was very, very, very lucky to listen to Beverly Jenkins on a panel in DC, I want to say it was. And one of the things that she said when she was talking was that we are our ancestors' happy endings. And when we talk about sort of, the sort of cultural trauma in general,
Mm-hmm.
sort of seeing those happy endings on the page is sort of this moment of saying, okay, we made it. We can, we exist. We can write joy and happiness.
Yeah.
Jumping on that, I genuinely feel that, like, and this is the thing I bring to just my daily life, that being joyful is one of the most radical and important things I can do to honor that ancestry that I had. To say, like, I'm here and all your sacrifice and everything you did was worth it, because I'm here and I'm happy. I'm going to be happy for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I love that. I love that. And
Tova of Patri, off your follower on Twitter, made this for me, and this hangs over my desk, like where I'm sitting now, and so I thought that was happy to share.
Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect, because people don't, this is something we all talk about too a lot amongst ourselves, is that romance is political, romance is radical because we are telling these stories. I just got ping from Chrysalis that we've got 10 minutes. I mean, we can go over, but unless anyone needs to be somewhere, but we're at 11:50, but we can keep talking because I had some other questions, maybe not as serious. But we have talked about it a little because we've talked a little bit about these category covers that we've been seeing. Like Linda in the chat said, Harlequin has been knocking it out of the park. These Ryan's covers are just luminous, right? But there's a lot of discussion in Romancelandia about covers, illustration, cartoon, but I mean, I've had some things to say, but how much input do you all have into your covers? That's what I mean. I know, Thien-Kim, you haven't seen yours, or so if you have something, I don't know if you have had input into yours yet, or have some ideas of what's going to happen.
I can't share a whole lot, but my publisher did ask for input. And I sent them this really long email, and I think they were very receptive about what I was looking for and what appealed to me and what I liked. My cover will be illustrated.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a big discussion in Romancelandia on Twitter, and I'm just excited to know that there will be a cover that represents not just my characters but me as a Vietnamese American.
Yeah, well, that's what illustrated covers allow, and I think that there's a spectrum of illustration, and that's what people kind of really get het up about. But like Denise said, try Googling African American professor. There's not a lot of stock photographs out there. Jackie Lau talks about this a lot. And that's why she, finding stock photographs for her covers that she designs.
I'm all for illustrated covers because they sell books. People who don't normally read romance, right? Who don't read romance or feel the stigma of reading romance will pick that book off of the Target bookshelf or their indie bookshelf, and they'll try it and then realize, yeah, I do like romance, and I'm allowed to enjoy romance and buy these books. And
read it in public.
Yes.
Yeah. What about the rest of you? How much input do you have, or did you have into your cover? Stacey, you see?
I am Recommended for You by Laura Silverman is a YA that came out, which I loved, that came out comparatively recently. The heroine in that book, the heroine on the cover of that book has the most gorgeous curly hair. Yes. And the thing is, when you talk about Jewish people, generally speaking, when you talk about Jewish people, like the sort of the presumptive images of this woman who's like had, the flat, straight, like hair. The thing is that takes forever because very few of us actually have that kind of straight hair. Some of us may want it, but nevertheless, 90% of the time you're talking to people who do not have it. And so one of the things
that's, I think, like Ashkenazi,
you were talking about the whole long email that you sent to Ava, and like I sent a very similarly long email to Tuli with conversations with like pictures of covers that had Christmas things on it that I wanted in blue, because of course, like we were having a Hanukkah book, so I wanted it to be in conversation with all of the Christmas books out there. I also wanted my heroine to have the curly hair on the cover that she did in the pages of the story. I did not expect that would happen. I expected a lot of different things, but what made me cry, I'm gonna move a little closer, you can kind of possibly see my curls. I don't necessarily know how. All right. So the thing that made me cry when I got this cover, and one of the great things about this amazing bookmark is that Lucy took the cover. Lucy took the couple off the cover and put it on the bookmark. You can kind of see my heroine's hair on the cover of this book. It is curly.
Yeah.
It is, and I literally burst into tears. I think I was in Virginia with friends at the time, and I started to bawl when I saw this cover. Like, it was beautiful anyway, but the tiniest last bit was the fact that the heroine had curly hair.
I remember you asking for pictures from people to help you.
Like, I wanted to get it right. I wanted to sort of portray her as she is, as so many other Jewish girls are, who don't
not after a flat iron.
Sort of Christian culturally, like pale, bland, you know, sort of like idea, like. And yes, I know I had blonde hair for years, but it was not natural. But anyway, I digress. Suffice to say, like, you know, Tuli was fantastic and gave me the cover. I never, like, the cover of my dreams. So I got a lot of it.
That's amazing that, you know, that you have that. And Denise, did you also have that kind of input into your cover?
Yeah, so we actually were just brainstorming my second cover, and so I just went through this again, but my editor asked for, you know, examples of covers I like versus didn't. Are there images I have of what I think the characters look like? I am notorious for not actually describing my characters that closely, and you'll notice on this book you don't see their faces, because as a reader, I actually really like to be able to imagine the characters, and so illustrated covers I love, but I also think when we talk about covers more broadly, it's so important to sell the book. Like we want them to read it and love it and see themselves in it, but also we would like some people to buy it. And so the cover that fits the book and that fits the story and the author too, but like we talk about with so many other things, there's room for so many images of that that's not, for me, something I worry about too heavily, but I love my cover, but I definitely felt like I had input. There were a couple small things I wanted to change and they were changed very quickly, but I also think that publishers want you to love your cover and love showing off your book. And so for me, that's exciting. Like even I think with my my UK cover, like saying, I think the heroine's skin should be a little shifted this way or that way to feel like it was a good representation of who I wanted to show on the cover. And so that for me was really exciting because I think when we think about our books, like that's the face of our books.
Be like, look at my book.
When I was working with my son, it was imagining like, what's this kid gonna look like? Like what's his face gonna do? You know, what is he gonna look like? And so that's sort of similar with the books. And so I do feel like I had a lot of say in what I liked, what I didn't like, what I wanted to see.
Well, I mean, I didn't write any of the stories in Love All Year, but I did commission the cover and work very closely with the artist. And I wound up writing like an essay about the cover in the end of the book. If anyone wants to read it, I won't go into it now, but it's super important. You know, seeing that. And Marcella, what about for you? I mean, category romances have very specific covers. Like there's rules, right?
They do. And so for the category, the category, but it's just kind of a surprise that comes in your inbox. You do get to comment on it. And if you had any issues, like you can speak back to that. But with category, it's kind of just this really big surprise. So I'm going to hold it up really close. So
dress.
I love this cover. This cover fits. So for me as a reader, I really started reading romance with Joanna Lindsay. So I have the famous Fabio covers. And what would really drive me crazy with those is when the character would have a different color hair on the cover than in the book. And I think Denise said a little bit of, but I wanted the cover to match the book. Like I wanted to go story. And this year, I mean, this is the year of the coronavirus really taking over the world. So that actually impacted the way that they were able to do photo shoots and to do covers this year. And so when I saw this, it was already beautiful. And it happens to just perfectly fit the scene that it's supposed to be representative of. And they had to work extra hard to make it happen. And so I just felt like they just hit it out of the park. And when I hold it up, and her skin tone is very similar to mine. And so I hold it up and it looks kind of like me. And she's got curly. And so that feeling is so powerful and it's so wonderful. I love this cover so much. They just sent the UK version. And I also love that one.
Oh, yeah.
And her hair is big deal in the story. So all this emphasis on hair is just so beautiful for me. And then I'm working on a full length as well. That one is we're actually in the process, and they've been really generous in soliciting my feedback in the cover. And so we've been discussing the cover and asking, they've just been so good about it. I mean, we run into those same issues that like everyone has when you're trying to do a cover, and the same kind of underlying issues that underlie the whether or not it's illustrated, the whether or not it's a live photo, real, all of those things come to play, and it is a challenge. But they've been so gracious and wonderful in really soliciting my feedback. So I felt really cared for through it.
Yeah, and that's part of the own voices. It's not just the words on the page, it's that full representation. And like you're saying, I mean, putting yourself in the story and being authentic and telling your story. It's also telling your story in that, I mean, like I tell all my students, everything is a text. A picture is a text. And so people are reading that cover and getting information about the story, and to have it match the story is so important. And as you all said, it's also important in selling those books, you know, because I mean, there's a code, the books are coded in a certain way, like your cover, I mean, the Harlequin is just, it's coded, like this is a very specific type of romance. We know what you're getting, you know, and we're developing a new language for those covers right now, I think. And it's, well, anyway, I could talk with that again, that's a whole other panel, romance covers. So we're pretty much, we're definitely at our time, and we've talked by default about a lot of the other questions I had, but one last question. I do have a question in the Q&A that I'd like to put out. So what advice would you give to aspiring BIPOC writers? I attended a chapter RWA meeting and was one of 3 brown women in a room of 60+ attendees. I've tried not to feel insecure about it, but I am. Like, what advice would you give that writer? Who would like, anyone can jump in on that one. Marcella, you unmuted yourself.
Well, so it's interesting. So my experience with this, reading the question, it made me realize, I was like, oh, my experience of growing up in the Pacific Northwest informs a lot of my approach to situations. So I have at different times in my life been literally the only Black child in my entire school. And so because of that, I'm very comfortable being the only Black person in a room. I'm that's very familiar to me. And so that particular issue never rose up as a barrier for me. I did have fears about, like, I think I had early on fears of, I had a lot of fears. So really my advice is we live in a world as people who are from marginalized communities, we live in a world that's constantly telling us how it's going to hold us down. I think my advice in approaching art as a person of color, because art demands truth and art isn't really about what people are going to react to your work, is really to like anchor and ground in your work, in your truth, and in telling that truth. There will be work. There's always going to be work to sell the story, but to really getting in it is really ground in your truth and tell your story. And don't let the idea that publishing doesn't want you stop you from trying. That's I think the big thing is don't take in the idea that publishing doesn't want you too hard, because readers want you, because you want you, because you know the demand is out there. So this is what I do. I focus on the positive, focus on the end game, and ignore the hurdles as much as you can.
So I have actually been in a room at a RWA chapter meeting and being one of the handful of people of color in there. So I know exactly how you feel. You know, writing is such a solitary pursuit, right? We're at our desk or on our laptop, just typing away with only or with our characters speaking to us. And it took me a long time to find a community of, you know, BIPOC writers to be in. And I think that's what you're going to have to do, is just kind of put yourself out there. I'm the I am the treasurer of the SIMRA chapter, which is the cultural interracial multicultural chapter of RWA. You're welcome to join us. And we're a small chapter, but we're working really hard to make things active and really give that space for, of all people are welcome, but a space for people from marginalized communities and identities to come and find people like us who can relate to us. And I say, if you're on Twitter, Romancelandia Twitter is awesome. I really felt like I found my people there. And unfortunately, we can't go to in-person events like we need to, but make a point to reach out to that two other brown or Black people in the room and befriend them, because I bet you they're feeling very similar to you. And we're looking for that connection, and we want people who look like us, who've been in situations similar to ours, to become friends with and share this journey of writing that can feel very lonely at times.
Denise, did you have something also to say about that?
Yeah, I'd echo what both of you said. I think that hit so hard for me. I think too, and I say this broadly to anybody who's writing, is comparison is the thief of joy. But I would add on, it's also okay to look around and notice, because really whatever own voices story that is, you're going to experience likely, those microaggressions and those active aggressions that you experience in everyday life. You will get reviews that are racist, that are anti-Semitic, that are homophobic, that are et cetera, et cetera. You will be listed as the and more in lists of authors. You will be, left off things. You will have people mix you up with the other author who looks nothing like you. And, I think that happens for most of us in our lives. That's not something that's shocking that it happens. But I think it's also giving permission that it's okay to notice that. It's okay to name that. Maybe not on the mains and Twitter, because, don't bring stuff onto yourself you don't need to, but to have that in the DMs and those people that you can slide into the DMs and just be like, I need to tell you what just happened in this article or in this review. You're not supposed to read reviews, I know, or in this space or whatever it is to just, and that's true in general, but that it's okay to name it. And it's okay to be angry about it. And it's okay to say something about it, but also know that you don't always have to be the voice of that too. So I think there's a lot of agency in challenging things that are unfair or that are unjust. And there's also agency to take care of yourself. And so that was a lot of advice wrapped into one thing, but generally
very good.
Of joy, but it's okay to look around.
So
Stacey, I feel like I might know what you're about to talk about. Go.
So I'm gonna actually jump off of something that you said, Denise, which is talk in your DMs, because eventually you will discover that, because the thing is, being Jewish is different. Being Jewish in a fully Christian group, as most RWA chapters are, is different. It's not necessarily always something that comes up in conversation unless it matters to the board to pay attention. I was lucky in my tenure in RWA, New York City especially. The board was fantastic when I was as part of the chapter. But the thing is, as you discover in your DMs, you discover more and more people that you get to talk to that also share your marginalization. It might be time to create a community of your own.
Which we did.
In the last, and the thing is, one of the things I'd always wanted as the one Jewish person in most rooms, in most movements, I wanted a space. I wanted to create a space. And within the last year or so, it finally happened. And it is a beautiful and wonderful space of Jewish romance readers and writers. And it's one of the best. I have, I've got a whole bunch of different writer DM groups that save my sanity most of the time. But this one is different. This one is special. This whole sort of Jewish romance community. I said to someone actually that I kind of thought of it as Klal Romancelandia, but who knows? We'll eventually figure out what what we are, but like, it's important to have those people who understand, you know, who understand, no, I can't go to this event because you put it on Yom Kippur, or why exactly did you put a conference on Rosh Hashanah, or why, you know, or like all of these specific Jewish, whether it's religious, whether it's cultural, whatever it is, like whether, and like it's full of tons of different people, whether like people are at the beginning of their Jewish journey, whether like they're finding it again, whether they're just culture, it doesn't matter. Like people, it's just a great, wonderful place. So
and just to jump onto that, it's also a great sounding board, because you can come in and say, was this anti-Semitic? And whatever, or whichever group that you're in, you know, like was this, am I reading this right? Am I being, you know, and so it's a great place to work though, you know, Denise is like, oh yeah.
Step between, like, it's sort of
in
a lot of ways of those DM conversations.
Yeah, speaking of DMs, if you don't know where to look for those communities, because sometimes it's not public knowledge, is shoot your shot and DM that author that you've been admiring from afar, and you will be surprised how friendly romance authors are, and they want to grow that community, you know, whatever community that you're looking for. And if they don't know, they'll point you in the right direction.
And we have one more question in the Q&A that I want to hit, and then I wanted to ask you all for some recs before we wrap up. And like, you know, we could obviously keep talking all day, but one other question is, can you speak a little bit about your writing process and your relationship with your editors? Because you've all mentioned your editors a bit, and the person also wanted to know if Marcella's full length was repped by HQ as well. And I just wanted to say it is, and it's called The Wildest Ride, and it's coming out March 2020. But back to the first part of the question, Denise, can you talk, or everyone really, but can you talk a little bit about your writing process and that relationship with the editors?
Yeah. So I was in kind of a unique, well, not unique for the first book. It was already written because that's how you sell a book. But I really love my editor, Carrie Donovan at Berkeley, because she gives great feedback, but was also really cognizant of my voice still coming through. And there weren't very many, especially on the first book, there really weren't many times when we had different thoughts on how something needed to be, but it really was a conversation, which is so powerful, I think, in working with an editor. And there's this fear, at least there was for me, of I'm going to hand my book baby over to somebody who has the power to change my book baby. And they do, but it really is more of how do we work together to make this the best story. And even those changes that for me that were sort of killing darlings made it so much stronger in the end. And my second book is for me a much closer to my heart, Own Voices story, not only like racially, but with body size and some other things. And so we're editing that right now, and it's sort of that same thing. And it's so important to have, and if you can, to find that editor who, you know, you trust with your voice, which is such a big thing. That's like trusting someone with your heart, and we're here in romance, but who you trust to help you say the things you want to say in a really great way. And so, you know, if you have the opportunity to talk to different editors, and I think the same is true for agents, is to find an agent who appreciates your voice and who you can have that open, honest conversation with. So that's my process. Yes, I still cry a little bit when I have to kill my darlings, but I get over it because I really do have that trust with her, and trust that she sees, you know, kind of my vision for the book.
Mm-hmm. Marcella or Thien-Kim, Stacey, anyone want to jump in on that?
I think so. I work with Nick Cause at Harlequin, and she's on Twitter. So I first of all recommend really following her, because she is really doing a lot of great work to really kind of draw up a lot more voices, and she is really seeking out writers and seeking out stories. So follow her on Twitter. She always posts about when she's doing any kind of call or looking for anything. And it's funny. My pathway into writing has such that I love to kill my darlings, and I love to cut things up, and I'm just like hack that up, because I described it. I was like, working with an editor is kind of like getting spanks for your story. Like you're like, oh, it says you're gonna make me look good. So whatever it takes. So, but to have trust and faith that that person will understand. So I think that is a big important deal when you're working with an editor. It can be, I mean, it's also, it's like we this dance between art and business, like art. And so sometimes I think when you're with your editor, that's going to be one of those places, I mean, cover too, but where art and business end up butting heads. So having an editor, having an agent that you trust I can give you my full feeling, every hesitation, every reservation, everything I have. And even if you don't agree and you tell me to do the thing, I can fully trust that the reason is not because you don't understand me. It's not because you don't think it's good, but it's because you know the market better than I do. And that this change has to do with the market and has to do with the success of my book, not with something else. And so that is, I think, a necessary part to have a successful relationship with an editor. Is a certain.
Can you put your editor's Twitter handle, if you can, in the chat for everyone, if you know it? And then Thien-Kim?
You know, like everyone's saying, like trust is really important. Your editor is not they're not your enemy, right? So my editor is Erica Zhang at Avon, and she's been doing this for 20 odd years. So I have complete faith that she knows what's best for my story. You know, by the time that she got to my manuscript, I had gone through so many drafts. I was sick of my story. And I didn't know what I didn't know. Like, you know, you're just so close to a piece of work. You don't know what it needs or what it's missing. And that's what I really wanted, you know, that relationship with my editor to be like, this is not working, or you need to fix this section, because I know that they're going to make my book better. And because they have a different lens and different perspective. And that's so important to trust. And don't be afraid to get on the phone. I know some people don't do phones. I got on the phone with Erica several times throughout the process to just ask questions about her notes and, you know, give her, you know, talk about my concerns about certain sections. And, you know, we talked through it all. And it was just really good to have that sounding board from someone who's so experienced. And, you know, like, if there's something that you really want to you must have, like, you know, that hill you're going to die on, like, go for it. If it's that important to you, push back, because they want to honor your voice and your story. It's in the end, it's your book.
So,
and go ahead, and everyone go ahead and just pop your editor's Twitter handles in the chat if you can, so that people can follow them, and like they're saying, it's easy, just reach out. But you know, it's so easy to say that.
So
go ahead, Stacey.
Okay, so I went through huge revisions for both Miracles, and I'm going through huge revisions for the next book, which is History Lost, which is coming out on June 24th in 2021. Everybody's been talking about faith in their editors. I am literally in between. Like, the story matters, the words not so much. And especially when you're working, like, I was writing a very specific type of Hanukkah book, and I want it set in a very specific place. And Julie Sturgeon, who is amazing and wonderful and just brilliant, and I had long conversations about the sort of general aspects of both the setting and the kinds of sort of attitudes within the setting, like, you know, and also specifically the idea of sort of what the feeling of Hanukkah that I wanted to convey in the story. And she was wonderful. And this is why I love her so much. When I actually signed when I actually like prepared to sign the contract for my second book, I was like, she's going to be my editor, right? I said to my agent, I was like, we will make sure of this, because she is such a brilliant, like, she's so great at both listening and making my book a better book in general, like sort of shining the story in a way that I would not have been able to do by myself. So,
well, I was sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay, so we really, oh gosh, I'm sorry. Like I said, I would like to talk to you all day. But I wanted, yes, Marcella?
Can we give our Rex for our voices?
And I was gonna have us finish up by she's been waiting. What own voices, Rex, do you have for us right now? Like, what are you reading? What do you want everyone to read? You want everyone to read A Long Love.
I want everyone to read everything that Tracy Livesay has ever written. Tracy is amazing. Along Came Love is the first own voices.
Yes.
That is me in a book. So Along Came Love is my favorite, but her latest release is Sweet Talking Lover.
Yes. Thien-Kim?
Oh, okay. I have a bunch. I was waiting for Marcella to give up more. I love all of Tracy's books, so I'm second. Let's see. My favorite audiobook this year is Worst Best Man by Mia Sosa. If you listen to audiobooks,
Yeah.
I was cracking up. My family was like, people, at Target were looking at me crazy. This book was laughing out loud. So good. Anything by Jackie Lau. Like, just buy all her books and read them. And I think she just announced that she got a book deal with Berkeley, so she's going to have even more books coming out. Let's see, Lush Money by Angelina Lopez. If you like wine, princesses, it's so fun and like lots of crazy things happening. I love it. And not a romance, but and not fiction is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Oh Shuk Vuong, and that's another. He's Vietnamese American from the West Coast, and it's a beautiful lyrical, poetic memoir about his life growing up, coming out as a queer person, and just so different from my experience, even though he's Vietnamese. And it's absolutely beautiful. I recommend everybody read it.
Thank you. Denise?
I've just been like crossing off ones that other people have listed, which is so great. But a few I'd add that I haven't already talked about, literally anything by Talia Hibbert, by Kennedy Ryan, that I have a DM thread with her is just still amazing to me every day. Alyssa Cole or Priscilla Olivares. Two that are coming up in 2021 that I'm really excited about. I just read The Intimacy Experiment by Rosie Miller, which is like, it's amazing.
Dying for this book.
It's so exciting. It's so wonderful. I got to read an arc of it.
It's Hot Rabbi, isn't it?
Exactly. Like, it's representation. Like, it's so, anyway, sorry.
And then it's not coming out till later in 2021, I think. But The Blueprint by Taj McCoy is just going to be amazing around not only like racial representation, but fat rep. And it's got some steamy scenes in it that I've got a preview of. And so I'm really excited for all of those.
And Stacey, what about you? What do you have for us that everyone should read?
I wrote an article for Alma,
right.
called that they titled "We're Obsessed with These Jewish Romance Novels. There are fantastic ones." I want to give a special shout out to Jennifer Grayson's Holiday in Manhattan, which is an interfaith romance that Thule published in 2019. I absolutely believe that without this book, Miracles and Menorahs would never have happened. I also want to give a special and then Recommended for You by Laura Silverman. It is the most gorgeous, adorable Jewish YA. Like, it is fantastic and wonderful. I also want to talk about Alice Murray's books. They are fantastic, sweet, and lovely. Zoe Archer, no matter what name she's writing under, is absolutely brilliant. Rose Lerner, I love her writing so very much.
Yes.
And I cannot finish this conversation without talking about the amazingness of Felicia Grossman. Her historicals are beautiful, gorgeous, and evocative, and I so want to read more of them. Melanie Ting, whose books I adore, hockey romance, and so much more. And I absolutely adore the books coming out of romance class, but in particular, Mina Esguerra is just brilliant. Kiss and Cry and So Forward are my favorites of them because they're just they're just wonderful. So
for folks who don't know, Romance Class is a group of Filipino writers writing in English. And if you just go to the hashtag Romance Class, you'll find all of them in their books, and they're starting to do audiobooks and even I think some web series, right? And it's just, it's amazing.
Hello Ever After is just wonderful.
Right. So for anyone who isn't familiar with that, it's just a really great group, and Mina's fantastic. And I also want to say that tomorrow's panel, Talia Hibbert will be on that panel along with a few others talking about bodies and representation in romance. Olivia Dade will be on. My little heart.
Tosh, who I mentioned, will be on as well.
Yes. So that is definitely going to be a great panel that I will not be missing. I will set all the alarms this time. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the Frankfurt Book Fair for hosting this. Thank you to Chris Alice for arranging this. It was so much fun. I talk to you all the time. Anyway, and so Marcella, I'm going to find a way to talk to you now that you're not on Twitter. I'm going to have to find a way to talk to you. You have my email address. And so I will see you all probably later today. See you. But thank you again so much for sharing all of your stories and advice for everyone. And thank you.